Good evening and welcome. This is the People's Platform. Our topic of discussion tonight is the importance of fortifying foreign policy to facilitate economic recovery. Our guest this evening is foreign policy analyst Kusum Vijaytilaka. Good evening and welcome, Kusum.
Thank you, Sonali. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Good to have
Thank
you
for the
here.
opportunity.
Absolutely. Kusum, let's dive right in. Now, foreign policy must be an extension of domestic policy. First of all, let's talk about how Sri Lanka's lack of policy stability and political steadfastness has essentially meant that Sri Lanka's foreign policy is skewed, short-sighted and lacking in direction and terrible at worst. Speak to us about, briefly, about the implications of this, the fact that we lack direction.
Okay, Sonali. So, Sri Lanka's foreign policy, if I were to take it a broader view over the last 3-4 decades, we are an extremely engaged country. We have a lot of engagement with multiple international organizations. We have bilateral partnerships. You would have noticed the number of embassies we have, foreign embassies. So that's a barometer of how much engagement we've had in the world. But if you look at the current government and their foreign policy, I have to say that there's been a very transparent skewing towards the Chinese orbit, if I can put it that way. Mm-hmm. I think everyone's well aware of the cancellation of, for example, the Japanese light rail project, the controversy over the oil tanks with India. So there have been a number of, I would call them missteps in terms of foreign policy, which has obviously given our international partners the perception that we are perhaps more comfortable being in China's orbit. Now, I don't want to denigrate our relationship with China. It's a very important relationship, and certainly as a development partner, China has played a huge role in Sri Lanka. But at the same time, to answer your question, I think there's definitely been a skewing, and the implications of that are obvious because we are not in China's backyard. We're not in their sphere of influence. We are in India's sphere of influence. So India is the traditional superpower in the Indian Ocean. So, for example, the port city project, which has a Chinese involvement. It was a Chinese FDI. I think some economists call it an FDI. So when you look at that, we are giving a significant Chinese international player a foothold on India's doorstep, which I think has its own implications, as you mentioned.
I'd like to ask you about the fact that now that we're in a crisis and bankrupt, we're literally relying on credit lines from India, loans from China, aid from other countries and organizations. And Kusum, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this is not regular, this is not okay. And this vis-a-vis the IMF staff level agreement, which must be entered into, which is dependent upon Sri Lanka's government undertaking to stabilize the economy. So, the government has to literally give the IMF its plan for the next few years, how it's going to prove itself able to settle the debt, its creditworthiness, and then after that it will have to go to the board. Talk us through this process in a comprehensive manner.
Okay, it's not a complex process necessarily,
sure,
but certainly the IMF staff level agreement will have to take in all sorts of things like our debt sustainability, who our debt, what constitutes our debt. So I think the staff level agreement, as you mentioned, the Sri Lankan government has to give the IMF our plan. The IMF will give us certain expectations. There are certain ratios that we'll have to satisfy. But overall, we have to tell the IMF, this is our plan to increase revenue. This is our plan for foreign direct investment. This is our plan to reform the state sector. This is our plan to privatize SOEs. This is our plan to, let's say, a hiring freeze on the public sector. So these are all things, as you may have noticed me mentioning that list. It's a very unpopular list of things, especially in the state sector when you think about it. So that may be part of the reason why many of our politicians haven't really come out and mentioned these things, because these are all signals that you send to the international markets. These are signals that you send to bilateral partners. So that has been lacking. And I think even though there are various reports coming out, some say that the IMF staff level agreement is close, some say the IMF staff, when they came to Sri Lanka, were quite satisfied with the progress. Others say they were not, and others point to the fact that there hasn't been a general staff level agreement yet. So I generally didn't expect a staff level agreement so soon anyway. It is going to take time. But at the same moment, Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government right now does not seem to have impressed upon the rest of the parliament and the people just how we are going to move forward in terms of our costs. You'll see that coming forward in every country that the IMF goes into. They enter into what's called an austerity program. That word austerity is something that you will likely hear more and more as the months tick by in this year. Austerity is essentially a cutback of the government. It's a reduction in government spending. It's reducing your cost side. But if you were to ask me, how do you get out of a recession? The only way to get out of a recession is to grow your economy. So I just want for your audience to understand, throughout the world, just in the last 20 years, the IMF has entered 6, 7 different countries because of debt issues. So the IMF is not new to this. So I just want to impress upon you that the IMF has seen these issues before. They know exactly where our problems were, but at the same time, they can't tell us what to do. It's up to us to present them a plan, and that has to be internally discussed. That has to, all the stakeholders, whether it's a CEB union or whether it's a CPC union, whether it's the people that work in the state sector, whether it's you and I that have to pay double the amount for fuel. So all of this has to be discussed, it has to be reconciled, and then we have to see who takes the burden. Now, generally speaking, in austerity, I'm just going to tell you what the experience was recently in Greece, in say Tunisia, in Egypt. The poorest people in the economy, the most vulnerable, are the ones that suffer because they lose social services, the government stops spending, so there's less jobs from the state, there's less economic activity in general when there's a recession. So this is the debate between the IMF and the rest of the world. The IMF thinks that you have to reduce costs, which is true, we do, but the IMF does not focus on increasing revenue through anything other than taxation. And in Sri Lanka, in any country that's going through an economic recession, increasing taxation is extremely unpopular. So that's probably where the main conversation in Sri Lanka has to begin.
Right. Okay. Now, Sri Lanka needs to impress upon the IMF and its other stakeholders that it can be taken seriously, and time is of the essence, right? Now, I'd like to also talk about foreign media's portrayal of Sri Lanka. It's almost that of a cautionary tale of what not to be, a case study of where we shouldn't go. From the BBC to Al Jazeera to NDTV, news agencies portraying a tale that is bleak, beggarly and melancholic, that is Sri Lanka. So, don't you think that such portrayals are detrimental to Sri Lanka sort of portraying itself as a serious borrower?
Sonal, if I may answer your question like this, there's two sides to it. You mentioned foreign nations' perceptions of Sri Lanka and our credibility. If you say there's a lack of credibility, you have to say why. Right? The lack of credibility comes from the policy failures, because it's very clear that the tax cuts, the agricultural policy, how it was, the agricultural policy was speeded up from 10 years to, I think, almost overnight. So these policies have led to where we are today. It's not that Sri Lanka has economic structural issues. We have debt issues, we have spending issues, efficiency issues, we have a lack of manufacturing, a lack of an industrial base. All that is true. But the Sri Lankan debt and the Sri Lankan balance of payments and our current account was extremely manageable until the tax cuts. And when we ended up cancelling fertilizer, organic fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, we ended up shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of our tea industry, in terms of some of our export industries as well. We then ended up having to depend on other countries just to get our food security in line. So when any foreign media institution looks at the decisions that have been made and the clear line that you can draw from policy to economic collapse, I think it does lack credibility. I don't I can't say anything about that. But if I may just impress upon the audience that it's a very easy line to draw now. As I mentioned in my previous answer, Sri Lanka has been perceived as going towards China. Now, you mentioned the BBC, CNN. These are, Western liberal media organizations. So they obviously have their own narrative on the Chinese Communist Party and the growth of China and all of that. So Sri Lanka's perception as being a Chinese satellite certainly helps the Indian and the Western media narrative, because they would obviously want to show that, oh, there's a Chinese debt trap, this is what happens when China goes in, Western institutional building and institutions are much better than these, and that perception is there, and I mean, it's something that has existed, and we've given them ammunition, because we have changed our foreign policy in one direction and then gone into an economic collapse. So we're giving them a very straight line into this, which I don't think is completely accurate, but it's something that certainly can be debated.
Yeah, and this ties in with diplomacy and diplomatic relations, which go hand in hand, which are pivotal for a country to enable enhanced foreign relations. Whilst we can agree that it's a very nuanced and a very sensitive task, in the past we've seen the manner in which we've had political appointees. And if we juxtapose this with Sri Lanka's past, where we've had the Christopher Veeramantris, the Lakshman Khadragamas, who have really shone a light on Sri Lanka. And then you just take the random people who are politically parachuted into the foreign service, despite Sri Lanka having very meticulous foreign service exams, which are gazetted by the government. So, I mean, none of this adds up.
Okay, if I may, in terms of our foreign relations and foreign support during this time and related to our foreign policy, it doesn't even seem as nuanced. If I give you an example, in the 1970s, the president of Egypt, Nasser, sent us an entire oil tanker when we had an oil shock in Sri Lanka. He sent it to us and said, pay us later.
Right.
Sirimao Bandaranaike negotiated, I think, a few years later with Saddam Hussein directly, while Saddam Hussein was the vice president of Iraq. And she managed to secure 100,000 metric tons of fuel at deferred payments. So we've had extremely good relationships, and that's only the Arabic and Muslim majority oil producing countries. What's happened during this government? We had a major issue with the burial rights problem during COVID. Okay, now that was a very simple issue that was scientifically, the rest of the world had moved on, because the problem with burial rights actually came about because of there was an African disease that was could be transmitted with a dead body. So they superimposed that into COVID. And it completely, it tore apart a certain section of our society. And
absolutely,
certainly Muslim majority countries will look at that and see, well, it was a very insensitive policy. It was a policy that took many, many months to reverse, when the science was always showing in one direction. With that background, I don't think it's any surprise that we're not getting those oil tankers from these oil producing countries, and we're not directly able to. Our president, for instance, hasn't been able to visit a foreign country, an oil producing nation, and sit down with them. I can only say that I believe that's because he does not have credibility, because his government, his policy, remember, this is not just any executive president, this is probably the most powerful executive president Sri Lanka's ever had because of the 20th Amendment. So everyone knows it's his plans, his policy, and his party that failed. That's why we are sending the Minister of Petroleum with a Muslim minister to Qatar. And you saw the debacle with the Qatar charity. The Qatar charity was called a terrorist organization by Sri Lanka. So just in that very small space, Muslim majority oil producing nations, and our foreign policy over the last 2-3 years, and our domestic policy over the last few years, I think it doesn't need to be nuanced. It's very direct.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at a few tweets that I want our viewers to see. Tomorrow, island-wide protests have been launched against government mishandling the economic crisis. Hana Singer says the people of Sri Lanka are suffering and have a right to protest peacefully to demand a better life. Important for police and armed forces to act with utmost restraint. Protesters should also remain peaceful. Ambassador Julie says violence is not an answer. If you are going to protest, please do so peacefully, and reminding military and police to grant peaceful protesters the space and security to do so. Chaos and force will not fix the economy or bring the political stability that Sri Lankans need right now. And finally, the UN Human Rights Twitter handle says Sri Lanka ahead of large demonstration in Colombo on Saturday 9th July. We urge authorities to show restraint in the policing of assemblies and to prevent violence. All Sri Lankans have the right of freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. The manner in which these tweets are framed, juxtaposed with the incidents of police brutality, protesters being arbitrarily restrained, detained, when the entire country is in a state of utter helplessness, Kusum. How do you view this, and what are the implications of this?
If I can start with the implications.
Absolutely.
As we said before, the IMF I'm just going to mention the 21st century, okay? So just in the 21st century, we've had everyone from Ecuador, Nigeria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Greece. Now, Greece is an excellent example. I was actually in Greece in 2012 in Athens when there were protests. The Greek economy went bankrupt in 2009. After it had already gone bankrupt, the IMF granted Greece, which has a population of 10 million compared to Sri Lanka's 22 million in 2010. Greece received a loan, a bailout from the IMF of 250 billion euros. Now, Sri Lanka needs for this year at the most $5 billion. Okay, so you can see the differences in the values. Now, the IMF, as I said, have been to all those countries I mentioned. Some of those, Tunisia, for instance, in much worse shape than Sri Lanka has ever been. We still have structures, government institutions that are functioning. We still have a media that is functioning, a free media that is functioning. These are all very important distinctions to be made. Now, the IMF will not see a protest and say, well, we can't lend to a country where there's protest, because every country that the IMF has gone into, they go in because there's an economic collapse. Protests and agitations always follow economic collapse. In fact, a former economist of the World Bank, Professor Shanta Devarajan, said on CNBC recently that the IMF would certainly not consider, especially in Sri Lanka, the protests as impacting the negotiations, because the IMF have noticed that the protests began before the actual economic collapse, that the protests in many ways are asking for a similar set of reforms that the IMF might be asking for as well. So that's a very interesting comparison. So they're basically saying that the protests and the IMF might be on the same side. Now, I don't strictly think that's necessarily true when you consider the nuts and bolts of an economic agreement or a staff level agreement. But at the same time, the IMF is not going to stop negotiating with us because there are protests. Now, if on the other hand, there is a reaction to the protests and the state starts suppressing protesters, in which case, what we spoke about before, the credibility of the government and the credibility of the Sri Lankan state, it will suffer, because you cannot have the state suppressing peaceful protests. And it's always on the urgencies with those with the weapons. It's on the military, it's on the police to ensure that there is peace without escalating violence disproportionately. If any of that happens, in that case, I think the IMF will certainly consider that the government is losing even more credibility by responding to protesters with violence and military and police. So there will be impacts, but may not be in the way that people imagine. So I really hope the protesters remain as peaceful as possible. I don't expect it to be 100% peaceful, just considering how many people are expected. But at the same time, the government has to walk a tightrope, because they have to show that they have credibility, that they have control, and I think, unfortunately, they have neither.
Absolutely. We're going for a short commercial break. We're in conversation with Kusum Vijaythilaka, foreign policy analyst. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the People's Platform. Kusum, I'd like to draw your attention to the love triangle of sorts between Sri Lanka, India, and China. This is actually a question from one of our viewers who asks, how do you suggest Sri Lanka should structure its foreign policy to counter China's debt trap diplomacy, within quotes, without antagonizing Beijing?
Okay, Sonali. So, if I may just clarify, I wouldn't say that it is strictly a Chinese debt trap that we've gone into. You mentioned debt trap diplomacy, that's a different thing. But if I can look at Sri Lanka's debt, China has a significant portion of Sri Lanka's debt, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
But China also has significant investments in Sri Lanka. So, I suppose one might say the debt is proportional to their investments. But in the other sense, Sri Lanka's debt is also, let's say, 30–40% ISBs. Now, there are different reasons. For example, the largest growth in Sri Lanka's ISBs came under the Hapalne regime, where they, I think in 2017, there were major borrowings from the international sovereign bond market. Now, the difference between borrowing from the market and borrowing from your bilateral partners is the negotiation. The international financial markets are far more liquid, they're easily accessible. And the flip side is, like something that's too easily accessible, you can become a little bit addicted to it.
Right.
In which case you are more prone to borrowing more easily, whereas with bilaterals you may have more negotiations, you may have counter negotiations, etc. So, and in terms of balancing India and China, if we can just mention a few Chinese projects, let's say the port, the Magampura port in Hambantota,
Okay.
and the Mattala airport. Now, these projects, certainly the Mattala airport was funded by Exim Bank, which is one of the world's largest banks, not just one of China's largest banks. So any bank that provides a loan for an infrastructure project has to look at whether that project is viable. So when you look at the Mattala airport specifically, it's very clear that that project, no matter what kind of projections you put,
Yeah.
was not going to be viable. So in that case, how did Exim Bank approve such a large facility? So that's one aspect of the Chinese debt that I think needs to be looked at very closely. But to answer your question about balancing India and China, that is the whole point of foreign policy. That's why we have a foreign ministry and a foreign secretary. If this was an easy, straightforward formula, you would not need a foreign policy academia or scholarship. So this is where you have to balance each person's interests. You have to know what they want from you, what you want from them, and what you want from each other. So this triangulation is where Sri Lanka has clearly failed, because we needed development partners. China came in. Why weren't we already with India? Well, we have a political issue with India, with the 13th Amendment, with the LTTE, and there's a social issue with that as well. So we've always had a problem with being very deeply engaged with India on an economic basis. For that reason, China came and filled that gap. It was a very easy gap for them to fill, and they were very willing to fill it because of our geographic location and our geopolitical position. So in that sense, it's not easy. But one thing we can't do is what we've done the last 4 years, which is completely tilt towards the Chinese orbit. As I said before, that has its implications.
So for years, politicians have used this slogan that, look, Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation, we don't care about what the international community has to say about us, because we're sovereign, we're a dualist nation. And this rhetoric always features in the human rights discourse, Kusum. But now we've had to eat our words, because we've had to almost go with a begging bowl to countries for aid, for loans.
It's even far more insidious than that, Sonal, if I may, because if you consider, let me take Greece. Greece is a good example. There was a very good story by, he was a former Greek finance minister, he's now a world famous economist, his name is Yanis Varoufakis. He related the story of when he was first elected as finance minister of Greece. Greece was in debt. I think this was the maybe 2015, 2013. He went to the European Union and he gave a speech, and he basically said that we have to change the economic policy of Greece. Greece had been following an IMF program, and it had led to a contraction, a continued recession in Greece. So Yanis Varoufakis wanted to impress upon the IMF and the European Council that Greece has to grow, and for Greece to grow, they have to abandon austerity and change policy direction.
Right.
One of the senior members of the European Union, who is now, I think, the Speaker of the German Parliament, I think his name is Wolfgang Schäuble, and he mentioned, he stood up and made a comment, and he said that elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy of Greece.
Okay.
So understand what he's saying. He's saying that whatever your economic policy, whatever government comes in, your economic policy cannot change. Why? Because it's been determined for you by your debtors, or by your creditors.
Yeah.
So what's happening to Sri Lanka right now, or what could happen, is our economic policy will be drawn up for us by another country, and then we will present it as our plan, which I hope, given the quality, we have a lot of quality individuals in our central bank. I don't want a few names to denigrate the entire central bank and our monetary team. So I hope that they can come up with their own plan, but that also depends on the politics of the matter. As you know, the tax cuts of 2019 devastated our fiscal policy. Now, reversing that is one, but two is going beyond that. You have to tax people more. Who are you going to tax? Are you going to tax the working class? Are you going to tax the upper middle class? Or are you going to tax the corporates and the wealthy? So this is where the politics of the matter affects the domestic policy.
Okay. So let's speak at length about the solutions that we can look at. You mentioned economic policy, redirection. Now, given the current state of affairs with the 4-day-long fuel queues where people are dying in queues, the lack of subsidies, and the industries, the fishing, farming, agriculture industries predominantly, the export sector, how do you think, in your opinion, economic policy must now be redirected to facilitate this process?
Sunal, in my opinion, there's a lot of work on this subject in terms of Sri Lanka's lack of industrialization. So many people have heard of the liberalization period of J.R. Jayawardene of 1977. We also had a second period of industrialization and liberalization during the Ranasinghe Premadasa government, 1989-1993, where we saw a boost to our industrial manufacturing base. So industrial manufacturing for export has to be where we head. We are below many of the peer countries, peer group countries, regional countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore. Even Hong Kong and Singapore, you may assume they're service-oriented economies. They have very high industrial base. They have a high technology base. So that's one thing that we have to do. And I would just mention on every other industry you mentioned, we're going to struggle. Farming is going to struggle. Fuel queues are, there may be queues, but you and I will still pay double at the pump what we paid in February. We're not going to be paying below 200. We're going to be paying over 400 per litre of petrol. How is that going to affect economic growth? How is that going to affect jobs? All of that is important, right? So moving forward for Sri Lanka, the first thing we have to do is get our oil flowing. We have to get petrol resources. We have to get our country moving. Yeah. That has to come from our debt restructuring. So until we provide a plan for debt restructuring, we're not going to really get anywhere with all these other things that we have to do. So right now we are in this slump because we haven't got a plan to give to the international community. That's where everything else flows from, Sonali.
And finally, for all of this to happen, we need political will. We need a group of legislators in parliament to make the right decisions which are conscionable and in the best interests of the country and its people. How must we now move to that step?
Yeah, look, if Sri Lanka was a company, imagine it was a company, and imagine the company through its own policies completely collapsed. The cash flows collapsed, their staff, they had to let go, all of that. Now, the banks are being asked for more money for this company, right? What have we done as a company since we went into debt? We've changed, let's say, the prime minister. So in the company, assume we've changed the CEO. But the CEO is directed by the chairman and the board of directors. Has the chairman and the board of directors in Sri Lanka changed in the Sri Lankan government? No. All the power is still vested in the presidency. there have been no political reforms. There have been very few economic reforms to talk about. I mentioned we switched to the 2019 tax system. So there haven't been any substantial moves by even the new government. And the new government, you will notice the cabinet that makes decisions are generally comprised of the same party and some of the very same people who were in the cabinet when all these policy failures were enacted. So a bank looking at that will think, well, just because they've made a superficial change of the CEO doesn't have much powers according to the constitution of the company. It's all on the chairman. The chairman is the same person who had all these bright ideas. So why should we lend to them when fundamentally it's the same people making decisions? I'm not saying that a new government and a new prime minister can immediately solve the issue, but a new government with a fresh mandate can at least begin having the difficult conversations with the trade unions, with the stakeholders, with the state sector, to see what kind of program we have to undergo for at least a few years to make our creditors happy. All of that has to come from the top, and until we replace the cabinet with a cabinet that can have credibility in international markets, I think it's going to be a very drawn-out negotiation. I'm not saying the IMF won't lend to this government. I'm saying the stringency of the conditions, I'm saying the amount, the quantum of the loan, the restrictions, the payback, the interest, all of that will be highly dependent on who is giving the IMF the plan, and whether that plan has any credibility, and whether that plan has widespread public support. Because what is a parliament? It's a representation of the people. If parliament is no longer representative of the people, any plan that government or that cabinet or that finance minister or that prime minister presents to the IMF, it's just a piece of paper. It's got no legitimacy. And that is where I think Sri Lanka has to move towards. We need to get political legitimacy back. And that has to, I'm afraid, begin with replacing the cabinet and the prime minister and the president.
All right. Fantastic. Kusum Wijetilaka, thank you very much
Thank
for
you very much
joining
for the
us.
opportunity, Sonali. I appreciate it very much.
All right. And that has been the People's Platform. Do have a safe weekend. We'll see you again on Monday with the Sinhalese edition of the People's Platform. Take care and good night.